What is up, guys, and welcome back to Above the Middle, the place where we talk about all things personal development with me, Joe Gibson. This week we are talking about identity-based habits. So many of us make the mistake when we're trying to develop new habits and we're trying to reach our goals by just focusing on the goals. We think, okay, I want to reach that, I'm going to think about getting to that point, and that's what I want to get. And that's all well and good, except we miss one little thing, and that is our outcomes are based on our habits, which are based on our identities. And if you aren't changing that core identity, if you aren't working on changing your beliefs about who you are, then you won't be making long-lasting change. You might have the motivation to reach one goal, but are you going to consistently reach it if that core belief hasn't changed? It's very unlikely. And this is all talked about in James Clear's Atomic Habits, which is where I got this inspiration from. And it's only like the second chapter in the book when he talked about this, but when I read it I was like, this sounds like a concept that actually works, and it's so true when you do read into it. And I'm going to go through it a little bit with you guys today. Yeah, essentially we're going to talk about what identity-based habits are, how we can start to change our identities to create the change that we want. And then we're going to use an example, and I'm going to talk about anxiety. I'm going to talk about how we can use this concept to start changing the way that you think about yourself and the outcomes that you have from that core belief. So let's get started. So James Clear talks about identity-based habits, and he says that it's like a circle, and in the circle you've got the centre and you've got you. That's your identity. If you have a set of core beliefs, that's going to influence a bunch of behaviours, and that's going to be the next circle. And then after that, your behaviour is going to lead to specific outcomes. So a lot of us just focus on those outcomes without changing that core identity. And unless you change that core identity, you're still going to be carrying out specific behaviours that reflect that identity. So we have to change that belief about yourself. So I think the next question has to be, how do we change our identities? Like, how do we change those core beliefs? What are identities even formed out of? So if you believe anything about yourself, it's probably because you have evidence to support that. If you believe you are a writer, it's because you've written books. If you believe that you are a singer, it's probably because you sing a lot of songs. Whatever you believe about yourself, you will have evidence to support that. So how we start to change our identities is changing our habits. Because the more evidence that you have to support something, the more that you're going to believe it about yourself. So on that circle, it's kind of like we're working from the inwards outwards. We're changing that belief through changing our habits, and then that is going to lead to specific outcomes. So what we really want to do here is think about what habits can we be implementing into our lives that start to change this identity, that start to give us evidence that we are this person who we want to be. When I started going to the gym, I was not somebody who identified as a gym goer. And so it took a while for me to really get into it. But as I kept going, as I started getting stronger, as the evidence built up, I started becoming a gym goer. That became a part of my personality. So now when people ask, oh, well, how can you go to the gym every day at 5 a.m? Well, it's just who I am. Like, that's part of my identity now. It doesn't feel like a challenge to me. It's just part of who I am. And that's what happens over time. You start to build up that evidence that supports the new identity, and then the results just come to you. So let's go into our example today. I really wanted to focus on anxiety. We wouldn't go to an anxious person and tell them, okay, you need to run into that anxious situation and just deal with it. You don't say that to them. You know, they might overcome that one situation, but unless we're changing the core identity, the core belief that they believe they're an anxious person, then they're not going to consistently reach those goals. They're not going to consistently overcome their anxieties because there's that underlying belief there that they are anxious. They identify as an anxious person, so we have to start changing that identity for them. And we do that through looking at their habits, through looking at what things they are doing that are supporting that identity. So let's have a think, and I'll think about when I suffered with anxiety, or when I do suffer with anxiety. What habits did I have that were supporting that identity? So let's go through a list. Number 1, I'd avoid anxious situations. Number 2, I would have this negative stream of thought through my head, worrying about future situations and ruminating about past situations. Number 3, I would have a low capacity to deal with anxiety when it came up. I did not know how to cope with the feelings that would come up in my body. I could not self-regulate at all. And number 4, lack of self-image, lack of self-belief. So one of the things about anxiety is worrying about what other people are thinking about you. And that obviously comes from a lack of self-trust and self-belief. So if I am carrying out these 4 habits on the daily, I'm just consistently reinforcing the identity of an anxious person. And I can sit at the end of the day and look at myself and be like, I am an anxious person because I'm doing all these things. We have to start changing that identity. We don't focus on the goals, we focus on the identity. So we'd run through those 4 things and we'd start to think, how can I start changing those habits to healthier ones? How can I start counteracting them? So let's go through the list. So number 1, avoiding situations. If you are an anxious person, if you identify as being anxious, you'll avoid anxious situations. So we want to start exposing you to anxious situations. And here's another point. James Clear talks about habit formation. So forming new habits, it takes time and you do it in small steps. So I wouldn't say to an anxious person, you need to run into that anxious situation. We would start exposing the anxious person to those anxious situations very slowly. We'll do it in little steps. So let's look at number 2. So an anxious person will have that negative self-talk going through their head. So how can we start to combat that? How can we start to change that habit? Well, developing your mindfulness, meditating. I would suggest a daily meditation practice. As you practice mindfulness, as you practice meditation, you'll be able to start distinguishing yourself from your thoughts. You'll create distance between yourself and those anxious thoughts. As you start doing that, you'll start to combat the negative thinking. You'll be able to bring yourself back to the present moment when you feel yourself drifting off into rumination or worrying about the future. So that would be one habit which you would start implementing to combat negative thinking. Let's look at the 3rd behaviour, that low capacity to deal with anxiety and anxious situations. So when I used to get myself into anxious situations, I would freak out because I'd have all these feelings and I wouldn't know what to do with them. And as you probably know, anxiety is a really uncomfortable feeling. So how would we combat that? We'd look at implementing daily practices around breath work and again mindfulness. Developing breath work, being able to regulate your nervous system in anxious situations, focus on your breath, bring yourself back to centre. That will build your capacity to deal with uncomfortable situations. That will stop you from freaking out. When anxiety comes up, you'll be able to deal with it. Again, mindfulness, being able to bring yourself back to centre, not get caught up in that negative stream of thought. So that's how we combat that. And then number 4, the negative self-image, where we could look at doing things that you enjoy, living more authentically. I know for a fact that when I started doing things on a day-to-day basis that I enjoyed, that I truly enjoyed, I started to improve my self-image because I was doing things for me. So we'd look at what things you could be doing that are solely for you, that you enjoy. And then we'd look at how we can stop caring so much about what other people think about us, understanding that other people's opinions should not rule our lives, that the things that you should be doing for yourself, and you should not be building your life around other people, because ultimately you are there to make yourself happy. You have the choice to do what you wish to do. Gratitude journaling, so you can spend time sitting down each day and being grateful for things, writing what things you like about yourself, just improving that overall self-image so that you do not worry about what other people think about you. Start realigning your life towards you and away from other people. So if we step back and we now look at those 4 things that we've now combated, and let's look at the changes there. So now you're somebody who faces their fears, who doesn't avoid them. You're somebody who can combat negative self-talk. You're somebody who has the capacity to deal with anxiety when it comes up. You are somebody who has a positive self-image, has an improved self-image, so you don't care so much about what other people think about you. So are those 4 things, those 4 habits that you'd be carrying out on the daily, a reflection of an anxious person? They're not. And that's the thing here. That's how we start to make long-lasting change. We start implementing daily habits that reflect a non-anxious person. And as you consistently carry these out, as you consistently do these things, combat that negative thinking, challenge yourself, be able to deal with anxiety when it comes up, you won't start to believe that you're an anxious person anymore. And even though implementing those habits might be difficult to start off with, as that core identity starts to change, you'll start to believe in yourself. The evidence will be there to support you. Well, I've done all this. I've done all these things. I've challenged myself in all these areas, therefore I can do it in the future. That is truly how you start to reach your goals. That is truly how you start to change. And I am somebody who has done all these things, and now I don't look at myself as an anxious person, because I can look over those 4 things and realise that I don't do them anymore. I challenge myself. I have the capacity to deal with discomfort. I don't get lost in negative thinking, and I have a positive self-image. Therefore, I am not an anxious person anymore. As a result, your goals will come from it. Suddenly, you'll be able to face your fears because you've implemented all these changes. And we're not focusing on the goal, we are focusing on the identity. Once you start to change that identity, that will create long-lasting change because you'll believe it about yourself. So yeah, we'll finish off there today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Check out my blog where I talk about this stuff in a little bit more detail. Follow me on Instagram. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week.